How's it going, everyone? Welcome. Oliver Gonzalez here. So, let's take a look at the stacking context in CSS, which is part of the section on the CSS for JavaScript developers course made by Josh Camus, right? When he create now three courses, but the first is based on the uh, how do you call it? Based on the CSS for JavaScript developers. You also have is the React and how you can make some animations on that. But the idea of at least this course is to understand for sure once and for all what is CSS and how does that fit into the web developments. So not only by looking at the fundamentals, but understanding is how does it fit in the current 2026 web development. Now, because I know I want to dive deep too much into how do I get here. Just to briefly mention is the different sections that we have learned so far. First, by looking is at the CSS fundamentals, and then what are the things that are still relevant in 2025 and 6, right? And now, understanding is how the CSS rendering elements, aka the rendering logic, right? What are the algorithms that is used to put in place to now represent different elements on the DOM into screens, right? What is the visual representations? So aka is the box, right? So the box model describe how all of these DOM elements will look like because back in the old days, different browsers implement this at their own way. There were no standard, right? So designers need to have a common place where every browser start from there, known as the CSS reset. But as the years go by, then now browsers are stick to the CSS3 standards. So a lot of this now, all of these elements look like the same. However, there's some couple nuances in terms of specific elements layouts and some text decoration, some other forms of decoration for these elements. That still CSS needs to, or at least those browsers have this difference amongst them. So CSS resets is still useful, but to cover specific use cases from here, right? So, but in any case, and after that, right, is also to understand now how the content is presented, right? Which is the inline and the block, what actually means that, and by understanding is the anatomy of the box model, so the content, the padding, the margin, and how you can actually is work with it. So what you can do with the padding, the shorthand property using padding, the border, what are the specific way to define a border, and also look at another property called outline, which is useful for navigation or providing accessibility to your websites. And then the margins and how the margins depend on the layout, particularly the OG layout, the flow layout, allows you to now centering elements horizontally. And speaking of this layout algorithm, So CSS, you can think of this like a set of mini language, right? That you can opt in or out for into this specific layer, which is the way how the CSS is going to rearrange all of these elements, all of these boxes. So the OG, the flow layer, is now made of three boxes: the blocks, the inline, and the inline block. And each one of them has their own particularly behavior. The TLDR is that block element, you can resize its dimensions, but the content will grow horizontally, it won't line break. Unlike inline elements, you can't resize its element, the dimension, but it will line break the content when it hit the specific width that you set, or when it hits the viewport. And speaking of this dimension, and the other is the inline block that internally behave like a block, but externally as an inline element. So inline element don't take all the available horizontal space, and then this inline, in fact, well, they don't want to make any fuss. They take only the width that they need. And since with the layout, the OG, in order to set the dimension of a box, we need to look at the width and the height algorithm and how that is calculated, right? So with the width, it is mainly based on the so the width property have two type of measurements, whether it is pixels, root elements, and percentage, or keywords. So for measurements, so we use pixels mainly for layout, root elements for text fonts or fonts, and the percentage is when you want to now inherit is the dimension from its parent. So by default, when you use percentage, the width is going to look up the tree, right? But for keywords, so for example, the max content, you're saying, hey, I want the width of this content growth as much as the content. For min content, I want to look at the widest child element, and that'll be my dimension. And you have also the fit content, right? So hey, only take the available space that match that fit the content, or in this case, that fit the children element. So that's great, because when I look at the height, things are quite different, because again we have the two type of measurements, all right? Whether is or the two type of values, whether it's measurement or keywords. And a measurement we have is the pixels and the root element, and also is the percentage, which instead of looking up the tree to calculate it is height, it looks down the tree by default. So if you, for example, wants to use the 100% viewport here, so you need to be explicit about that start from the document, all right? But the root element in the document, and then down the line now pass down that height, which is if you're using now create app, or which is something that is deprecated, or the Next.js, right? You must put that at the root element is to set the height of 100%. Okay, so now you can is passing down that hide value, and then use that when you see fit, right? Because now browsers on desktop and mobile behave different or show the content different, especially on mobiles. They add now the address bar, and that is part of the viewport. Unfortunately, there is a particular property called SWV, which take only the small viewport on mobile devices. So it's something that's quite interesting. You can take a look at that if you'd like to. I will leave the link below. Uh, but with all of that, right? Uh, what's what's next is that in the OG layer, the normal layer, okay, we have also some specific behaviors, especially something called margin collapse. The idea is pretty simple. So elements that share the same margin fall into one single space. But to develop an intuition of how this works is quite hard because there is a lot of edge cases. And here, just to mention, is a couple one. So the margin collapse is vertically. They can collapse by nested elements. So the bigger margin wins. And just to mention is the most common one and relevant. And then I look at how can I create is a simple website using is the flow layer and how hard it is to do so. So this is the OG layer, right? And then next is the positioning layer. So CSS come with several layouts, all right? So you have now the normal flow, positioning layout, and the flex and grid, right? So right now we're looking is at the positioning. So anytime that so far we have looked at, we have looked at how to render content that now stack next to each other or on top of that. But what happens when you do need to show something on top of another one, right? So for example, so menus, sidebars, drawers, models, or anything, or even alerts, anything that is relevant to the user, or you want to show or do some upselling in your product, right? So that's great because with that, now to opt into this positioning layout by using is the position property, it comes with several values or several positioning layout modes. So you have the relative, absolute, sticky, and fixed. And if you want to opt out, you set that to static. All right. So I look at the relative positioning layout mode. So when you set that, it enables two things. It set constraint to the children elements and enable you to use additional CSS property. So top, right, bottom, and left. Right? When you don't set anything, when you up into the relative, but you don't set the position of that element, it's going to behave like an inline element, right? It's going to follow that. It's going to follow the normal flow. But when you modify this position, now it's going to move is in that dimension. So for example, if, let me do this, right? What about this? Yeah, so for example, if I want to make now, no, again, okay. If I want to do something like this, all right, to emphasize a specific element here, right? Oh, it doesn't. That's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. So the browser doesn't render that kind of elements. Okay, okay. Are you scared? um, okay, okay. That's interesting. Um, but the whole idea is that uh, now I can move these elements position. So if I say, let me actually do this. If I say position relative, right? Then I've moved this to top, and then starting to move this element here. You see, again, this is moving according to the normal flow, right? Because by default, that's the OG. So yeah, so we can move these elements here and there, and you might wonder, well, why I can move elements, for example, using now is margin, right? I mean, what is the difference between using margin here? So I can move these elements like this, right? But as you can see now, it is impacting the layer. So all of these elements are moving, right? Sometimes this is what you want, but for sometimes you just make only this particular element to move its position, right? So in the case you say, hey, top, I want you to these elements only to move that, right? And here you got it. And this is interesting because it's entering into something known as the stacking context. So how these elements now get rendered on top of that. So what happened here is that anytime that you now open to this positioning layout, you are telling the browser that this element must be on the top. So when you open to the absolute positioning, which is another layout mode, here, because you can think that you're going to add these elements as sticky, right? Unlike relative, which actually follow is the normal flow. On positioning absolute, you can decide where do you want to put it. However, is how the browsers know where to draw this element, right? And this is why we have this thing called is containing block, which is the how the browser detect that this is the element that is going to so this is the position of this element that is going to be anchored or rendered. So if I do this, so if I set this to absolute, right? It turns out that you are no longer able to see that, all right? But somehow the content there or the element is somehow rendered there. And the question is that where do you think these elements will be anchored, right? Because the default position of these elements is by when you don't set the element here like this. So when you don't when you only open to the absolute, it's going to look up the closest positioning layout element. And in our case, because the closest is the top element, this is where it's rendering this, right? So in other words, this element here is somehow must have the property positioning set in there, right? Or even this, exactly. So if it's not, if I for some reason not set that, right? Or if I yeah, if I disable that, so if I disable this, it's going to continue to put these elements now on this on here, right? If we take a look at this, and if I continue to remove all of this position things, right? So you get the idea that the root element at the end of the day, it is the justify content, padding, display grid. Yeah, if I switch off the display grid, as you can see, it is is behaving like that. But again, I don't want to break the layout. But what I just want to mention is that if you don't specify if you don't specify is the position of these elements, by default is going to look up the containing block. So far so good, because if you do now, it's going to move these elements to that layer. In this case, is moving. Oh, it's moving. If I'm telling here, when it. That's interesting. So if I say move top 1 pixels, right? That's interesting. Okay. All right. Look at this. Okay. Okay. So when you don't put when you only use is position absolute, it's going to look at the closest elements. Okay. All right. So when you makes sense. So if I say now 0, right? But it's looking at that, even though if I say now right 0, or in this case left 0, right? Okay, makes sense. Okay, so the intuition here match. So what happened here is that if you use only position absolute, it's going to look up the closest containing element, aka the closest position layout elements. In this example is here, right? But when you now set some position property, it's going to use that as part of the origin. In other words, it's going to grab that element and draw into the origin, or in other words, it's going to start the elements from the top of the document. So if I put it here and then I say, hey, text color, it's color, sorry, color of the content white, you can see that. However, if I scroll down, I don't see the elements. I only see the elements here. So sometimes this is a desired behavior, but sometimes you do want to now is centering these elements when the user see this, right? So to do so, you not only specify is the width of that element, all right, where in our case the width is already set that, but also is you can now specify where this content will be centered. So to do so, you can use a special property called inset and then say, hey, I want you to be this 50-50 pixels, for example, right? Or you say 50%, it's 25%. Oh, exactly. It's 25%. That's right. Let me add some background here, color to say black. Yeah, say black here, right? So it's now centering our elements here. So what this property is doing is to set the position of this, set the content position here 25% around all of the border, right? Because that is quite impossible condition in this case, since well, it doesn't know how much it will grow, right? It will try to guess that. You can use now margin auto in this case to say, hey, please center these elements completely around all of this. In other words, margin auto is a hungry value, so it's taking all the available space in each one of those borders, and now set the content as it is. Why it changed this, you might wonder, right? Well, because again, we are hitting a couple impossible position or situation where we're saying, hey, I do want us to put now the content 25% from the top, the right, the bottom, and then the left. But because it works from the origin, which is top and left, that's where it started to position that. Here is kind of impossible condition to meet. But when you use now margin to say, hey, I want to make the content of this box, right? The margins take all the available space. The take is the all the available space at the top and at the right, bottom and left. Using now in set is something that is used. So if I don't do this, all right, this inset property is going to now behave as it is, right? So you say, hey, because I don't defining is any width. This guy, I don't defining is the position of this element. Despite that I'm putting here, right? Despite that I'm putting here. But I am not is telling where I want to render this content. So if I specify a width for this, let's say 100% pixels, right? Or something like this, 300 pixels. And then I specify is the inside where I would like to put this element, right? If I say 50% or 50 pixels, right? It's gonna try to make these conditions to happen, but it all starts from top and left, right? It's going to take in consideration that. So if I remove the margin here, it's gonna put now these elements on that condition. So top and left are the priorities here. So this is useful to centering elements here, right? So for example, let's say if you want to show some sort of model here, yeah, some sort of model here to upselling here stuff. So this is how you can actually is add that. So say this is the border color, sorry, border radius, 50%, 50 pixels, you know. This is how you can start to draw these elements on top of another one. All right. So the question is that how these elements are how the browser know how to render elements on top of another when they are overlapping, right? And this is known as stacking context. So this is stacking context, all right? Let me actually go to the stacking context here. So the way how the flow layout render content is that the background is on the background. So the background and the content so the background and the border are on the background, but the content is now rendering in the same layout. So on the flow layout, this is why you have this kind of stuff. And as you can see, is that it's going to render the block, or it's going to render the box, the background and the border on one layer, all right, and they're not going to overlapping, but the content will be rendered is on the same layer. The DOM order wins in this case to decide which element is going to render on top of that, but the flow layer wasn't meant really built with layering in mind. Okay, the truth is that the flow layout isn't really built with layering in mind, and most of the time when we want to layer elements, we'll want to use position layer, which is what we want to do in this case. So when we opt into this, especially with relative, now positioning elements will be always rendered on top of non-positioning elements. So you can think of this as a two-stage. It first renders the non-positioning elements, so flow, on the flow layer, on the grid, and the flexbox, and then on top of that is positioning elements. So absolute, relative, sticky, and fixed. If you have several elements like this, if you have no sibling elements promoted to the relative position, the DOM order matters here. Okay, why this is important? This is a good question, because you can alter the order of how this element is going to render via the C index. So this is a nice trick to do so, and it all starts by looking at how these sibling elements are rendering on the positioning layout, right? So if you want to change the order of that, right? So X here is moving elements on left to right, G up and down, and C is forward and backward, right? For a good animation here that Josh made it. So when you set elements index to auto, is equivalent to 0, so therefore they are not promoted. But any value greater than 0 can be promoted to sit in front of your siblings, aka you are promoting that into a new stacking context. He also mentioned negative C index, but it doesn't cover that because it doesn't offer, so the complexity doesn't work well. And the point of this is that this is stacking context, which is how you tell the browsers to render elements on top of another when they're overlapping. Okay, on the flow layout, the backgrounds are now overlapping, or now are, yeah, the background now overlaps. You can overlap the background, but you can't overlap the content in the flow layout. But now on positional layout, you can now overlap elements, background and content on top of another one, right? And if you have sibling elements, right, the DOM order matters. You can change that order by using C index, and also you can opt in to creating to create a new stacking context with different properties, combination of property. So the most common one is when you use now positioning relative and absolute with the C index. Makes sense. Greater than 0 value. Greater than 0. Then you have now the opacity. So anytime that you set opacity, you are opacity to a value less than 1, you are creating a stacking context. Position fixed and sticky with no syntax needed, exactly, no syntax needed for this value, it create a stacking context. Mixed blended mode, other than normal, create a stacking context. C index in this layout mode, flex and grid creates another stacking context. And using transform and filter and clip path or perspective, do that as well. And then the isolation, right? There is a nice little app here. Yeah, browser extension to inspect those elements. CSS Stacking Context Inspector, as you can see, that works for Chrome and Firefox. And I'm looking now at managing C index as well as portal, right? I already am taking notes out of this. Isolated stacking content, exactly, managing C index. So here's the thing. Because you can get stuck fighting this C index war, and here's how this happens. So you have an element which is rendering behind of another. Okay, so you have an element which is rendered behind of another, but you want to be it up front. So you promote that element using a C index, some arbitrary value like 100, and now that solves the problem. But later on you have another element that needs to be even higher than that. So again, you just pick an arbitrary value, and this process that repeats over and over and over. So as the application matures, the number gets bigger and bigger. So there is a C index inflation. And the good news is that we don't have to play these reindeer games. I really love that. Reindeer games. Los juegos del venado, o cazar al venado in Spanish. Okay. So you don't have to play this kind of games. So in some cases you can avoid entirely the C index by relying on the DOM order instead. And in other cases we can bundle up layers into isolating and stacking context. And here is mentioned is two strategies here, okay, of how you can managing is a stacking context. Particularly managing is the C index. All right, so whether it's you swapping the DOM order, all right, or relying exclusively on the DOM order, swapping the DOM order is something that is not advisable. Here there is no car. I think it actually break. It's supposed to render something here. Hold this. So you got it? Okay, makes sense. But here is following is the DOM order. So if I put now this, right? So you can see that it's now rendering is on this stacking context. So car here in this case, that this is a position relative, again is promoting all of these elements into this new stacking context, but based on the DOM order, right? So this will be first, and then on top of that it's going to render this another one, and this another one, and so I do think which is okay is this one, and then you have this one, right? There is rendering on that, and here. So you can think of this like the car is rendering first, and then on top of that there's another SVG image, and there's on top of that another LH, so the green one, and then on top of that is this one, and then on top of that is this yellow one, right? And here we're not using is index, not at all, just relying exclusively on the DOM order. Makes a lot of sense. You know, makes a lot of sense. So swapping the DOM order to control the rendering can be a useful trick, but isn't always appropriate, right? Because when you swap the DOM order, it impacts the accessibility. And the other alternative, all right, of managing this index is isolating stacking context. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, isolated stacking context. Let's suppose we're building a pricing page here, and we implement the design we receive. I do think I already took notes of this. Okay, exactly. Isolating stacking context. So we implement the design we receive, and we win up with the following UI. So we are all set to ship it when our PM swings by our desk and say, "Hi, Elder, the marketing teams want us to make a change." The new design emphasizes the pro plan by floating it so that it sits above the other two cards. We can render this sort of UI using something like Flexbox, but we'll hit a problem. By default, elements stack according to their DOM order. Exactly. So if you try to do this, right? Exactly. If you want to do this, I say, hey, let's go to now for upselling our products. This is the new layout, right? And you can think, well, I'm going to create now a flex box. Again, something that we're going to see that later. But again, I can create now as a flex box where I can show is each one of those elements, right? And now make this element or render this element on top of that, right? Or what enhancing is it is dimension, right? Do some tricky stuff there, but again, what you want to do is that promoting these elements here, right, on top of the another one. So we can render this sort of UI using something like Flexbox, but we'll hit a problem. By default, element is stacked according to their DOM order. So we will will win up emphasize the wrong car, right? Again, if you're using now is the position and layout on that. So in other words, it's gonna show this and then this and then this, but the contact us will be on top of that. So unfortunately, we can use the DOM order swap trick we learned early. It will be a mess up the keyword tab order. So so instead we'll use now C index, giving the middle card a higher C index value that shows up on top of that. And here's how this is going to look like, right? So the second here, which is say the primary, it will have now an index of 2, right? So we test this code and it works great. However, because now we are rendering this element using this second layering or this using the index 2, but something later on broke here. Hey, Oliver, I think your recent deploy broke something. We check it out, and sure enough, something very funky is going on. It's like, why is this thing is working? So it seems that we forgot about the side trick header, and weird is sleeping between the car. So here's why this is happening. The cars and the headers are in the same stacking context. Their C index values are being compared and applied, and it just so happens that the header shares the same C index value as our primary car. Wait, what? Here's why this is happening. The cars the car and that header are all in the same stacking context. Their C index values are being compared and applied, and it's just okay. Their C index values are being compared and applied. C values of what? The car and the header are in the same stacking context. Oh, Mm. Ah, okay. Mm. So here's what this is happening. The car and the header are in the same stacking context. Their C index values are being compared and applied. And it just so happened that the header shares the C index value as our primary car, right? And here is a wider high. So you have now the header, and the primary here. Because the DOM order matters, right? The primary car now is rendering or is showing up later on. And in order to fix this, how will you fix this? Um, well, um, mm, I can create if we can isolate those C index. So based on what I have learned, how can I isolate this index here? You can say, hey, if I increase now the C index of the header, now that'll work. All right. So I am promoting is this as it is, right? So for example, let me see if I have the exercise here, right? That's interesting how it showed that. All right. So if I now render this element as it is here, that's interesting. Um, um, no, but I don't want to isolate this. If I can say is primary car, right? If I now render this, I say primary car, I can say something like this. It's like playing with the C index. You say, hey, this is now 3, right? And now this will work as expected. But again, we're entering into the C index war. I'll be right back. Into the C index inflation. Okay. Okay. Okay, now things start to make sense. Yeah, yep. Yeah. All right. So now this works, right? So yeah, so we're saying is like, hey, the civilian elements. Again, it is important to think of this as structure here. You're saying, hey, I'm gonna render all of these elements into a flex box, all right? Which is in terms of the HTML, you say, hey, this is now the content that I want to render. Okay, this is the container HTML element. Let me see, is this? So this is the container HTML element, right? We'll have all of this. This is there you go. This is the container of this section, all right? So this is the container, right? Yeah, so this is the container here, okay, the section, all right? In this section, we'll have to render all of these different cards. So if I tell to this if I now make, if I want to promote each one of those elements to be on top of that, I just say, hey, put that in a position and relative, all right? Which is what we're doing here, right? I don't want to provide any C index here, all right? And what it's doing is now rendering these elements on, so promoting each one of those elements into a positioning layout, right? And they're going to render is based on the DOM order, right? This one, this another car. But the design or the marketing team say, no, we want is that this element, this car actually show up. So what I can say is, let me now is promote this element into a new stacking context. Let's say 1, right? And now everything worked as expected, right? We say this one. And now everything worked as expected. But here's this a funny thing here. Because now the header and the car, right? They are now on the same C index. And the C index is not a global value. So because these sibling elements, right, now are the, yeah, what am I looking here? I'm looking here is that this element and the element here both were promoted to the same layout. Okay. So these two elements, the header and the primary, both of them were promoted to the same stacking context level, in this case 1, and because the DOM order matter, so the last one is going to render on top of another one. All right, so in this case is rendering here. So one way to solve it is to say, no, well, let me actually is now promote this upper element on top by changing the C index. And then now everything worked as expected. But as you need to add another new element, then you pick some arbitrary random values to put that element on top of that, and then the process repeat. And as your application grows and grows, you managing this C index inflation becomes quite a nightmare to keep track on. So instead of doing that, right, you just promote that element into its own stacking context. So in other words, by promoting that, you say, hey, I want to make, I want to now is use the isolate property here, try remove me, and then scroll the page. So what you're doing is promoting this set of elements to its own stacking context. So let me read about this. The isolation property does, or let me actually figuring out here. If I remove this element, if I remove the isolation pricing, right? So what it's doing is now creating So what it's doing is now creating is, so if I modify this, it's interesting. So no matter which C index you are, okay, but it's creating now a stacking content based on the DOM order. Because for some reason you should put it now something like this right here, right? That's interesting. It doesn't matter the DOM order is is now rendering into that particular stacking context. So in other words, if you now keep with this, so it's like respecting is this. So the isolation property, so ever since discovering the isolation property, I have been using it a ton. Whenever a child within a component applies the index value, I add isolation isolate to the component's pattern. This guarantees that we won't see weird slip in between bugs, like the one we saw with the sticky header. But if it doesn't contribute to all of the C index inflation or force me to pick a value. Adam Watham, the creator of Tailwind, has a similar discovery it is value and has added an isolated utility to the library. Here is a light editable version of the code we have been talking about. Play with it yourself to see how it works. But that is creating flexible. This is snippet use CSS that we haven't seen yet, like flexible and fixed position. We'll learn much about this stuff soon enough. There is one interesting interaction here though. The car elements can use the index and even they don't set the position relative. Yeah, the car elements can use the index even if they don't set position relative. This happened because flexible algorithm use the index property in the same way that the positional layer algorithm does. C-index doesn't work in flow layer, but it does in Flexbox as well as the grid. And we'll learn more about this in Model 4. But here's the isolation. It's supported by all model browsers, but not by Internet Explorer. If you need to support Internet Explorer, you will need to find another way to create a stacking context. Okay. But again, the isolation property, instead of adding positioning relative and C-index to our pricing selector, we can do this. Isolate. The isolation property does precisely one thing: create a stacking context. It has the same effect of flattening all the child elements, but it does not so without requiring that we also set the C-index on the pattern. But it does so without requiring that we all set the C-index on the pattern. It is the lightest touch way to create a stacking context. So again, it's creating a stacking context, but the order. Let me see if that fit my intuition. So if I say, hey, if I say isolate, right, and then I put this isolate, isolation, isolate, right? Oh, makes a lot of sense. Exactly, makes a lot of sense. So you are now creating a stacking context based on the DOM order. And when I scroll here, I'll be able to see this as it is. Exactly, they are passing that. Okay, but without it, you say no. Follow is the same. So now follow is the algorithm to render these elements on the top. Look at this. And when you again, you're not promoting these elements. Is using is the DOM order. But if you do this, see so if I now change the header to and alter the DOM order, right, is now going to render these elements behind that. Okay. The whole point of this is how do you going to render this set of elements one on each other? Okay. Makes. All right. Okay. Okay, okay, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Okay. Now it makes a lot of sense. Ah, okay. So this is stacking, counting, and promotion of these elements here. Okay. All right. Okay. So the TLDR of this stacking context is to answer these questions. How now the browser render elements on the top for when elements overlapping, right? And this is using now this concept known as a stacking context. Uh, in Spanish is contextos de pila. So the same way as you put now things on top of another one, right? If you carry out when you bought some stuff, some pizzas, right? You put on top of that stacking context. Okay. So okay. Yeah. So um so the idea of this is when you want to promote elements to be rendered on top of on another, uh, you can use so flow layouts render these elements, render background elements, so the overlapping background elements, but not the content. But position layout actually follows the DOM order. Uh, uh, but positioning elements, uh, they render positioning elements on top of non-positioning elements. Okay, so non-positioning elements, or the thing here is, this is, you can think of this like two-phase. Is rendering first non-positioning elements, the browser, okay, flow, flex, and grid, and then positioning elements. So relative, absolute, sticky, and fix. Okay? But if you have now sibling elements on the positioning layer, the DOM order wins. So, uh, but sometimes you want to now break that flow because sometimes it is quite convenient based on some specific design. All right, so you can opt into creating a new stacking context using its C index, and there are several ways of how you can promote an element into this stacking context. So you have now the C index with positioning relative and absolute. So opacity less than one, with a value less than one. Mixed blending, transform. That's interesting. Okay. Okay. Transform. So transform, filter, clip path, and or perspective, in positioning fixed and sticky, and now adding C index to flex or grid containers. And also is the isolations. But when we explore managing as a C index, is because a specific use case. So sometimes you need to render one element on top of another one, right? So, or sometimes you have an element which is rendering behind of another one, but you want to be in front. So you pick a bigger value in the C index, maybe 100, and that solves your problems. Later, you have another element that needs to be even higher than that. So you pick another arbitrary C index value, And then the process repeat, and as your application grows in complexity and matures, so you have now this C-index inflation. You need to know how to handle that. And there are two strategies right now. Well, to avoid playing these render games. So, or you rely is on the DOM order, or swapping the DOM order, which is not recommended for accessibility, all right? Or you use now this isolation property to promote an element here. That makes a lot of sense. And when you do that, they're going to be in their own stacking context, and they will follow is the DOM order, right? And they will follow is the DOM order. Some certain conditions may apply. But most of the time it's going to create its own stacking context, and it will is respect the order, right? So for example, like this, and this is a very interesting stuff here. Holy hell. Exactly. So what it did here is to say, hey, I am rendering is now the header below this pricing section. And that's why it actually was expected. However, if you do this, if you swap in the DOM order, it makes your app harder to navigate. For those who use assistant technologies. Holy hell. oh my god, I do get it. Okay, so then you got now Portal. This video reference Portal, which is around an advanced React features. Stay with me. Okay, we have time. Okay. Alternative exists for most component-driven frameworks. React Portal, Angular Portal, Vue Teleport, and Svelte Portal, third party. Same idea, just different name. Also, you probably don't need to fuss with portals directly. Portals are low-level tools intended primarily for library authors. They often use for tricky UI elements like models, tooltips, and drop-downs. Okay. Anytime you want to make a model, tooltip, and drop-down, these sort of elements are notoriously tricky to build properly, especially when considered touch device and accessibility. Exactly. Touch devices and accessibility, the DOM order. Okay. Instead, I recommend using a style-agnostic accessibility first component library like Radix primitive. And by accessibility, it is that they follow the web content accessibility guidelines. Right? The perceivable is operable, robust, is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. All right. The web content accessibility guidelines, version 2. There currently is on the version 2.1, but yeah. Version 2.1. Exactly, they add new criteria. Okay, for their accessibility. They add new criteria. Okay. But can you please? Forbidden. What the French stuff is this? This one. Exactly. Okay. Web content accessibility guidelines. 3 draft. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Summary. Mm-hmm. And the techniques, sufficient techniques, advisory techniques, failures, accessibility conforming testing rules. Okay. And this is the, oh no, there's a new standard here. Okay, the 2.1 was in 2018, right? Non-text content, time-based, audio only and video only, pre-recorded, captions, audio description, can, okay, time-based media, adaptable, distinguishable. Okay, this is part of the principles. This is perceivable, text, time-based media, adaptable, distinguishable, operable, keyword accessible, keyword no keyword trap, keyword no exception, character key shortcut, enough time, seizure, seizures and physical reactions, navigable, input modality, label in name. Okay. Text label express something in human language. Okay. Benefit speech input users can directly activate control on a page with fewer surprising changes of focus. Understandable, readable, predictable, and input assistant. Compatible, like this, is parsing name, roles, and status message. This is from the 2.1, and then on the 2.2 is this one. I think they enhanced that. Distinguishable, use of color, keyword, enough time, seizure, navigable, input modality, readability, readable, predictable, input assistant, compatible. Parsing, obsolete, and remove. Interesting. Assistant technologies can properly present page content, create web page according to a specification, but some of them are obsolete. Ensuring that web page have complete start and end tags and are nested according to a specification help ensure assistant technology can parse the content accurate and without crashing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Okay. And you can compare between one and another. Right? One and another. The same for adaptable. They hasn't changed anything. For operable, you got this. The navigable. You got this. Oh, focus not obscure minimum, and they remove that. That's interesting. In the focus appearance. Oh, interesting. They remove that. They remove focus. They remove focus. Users movable content. That's interesting. A page has a sticky footer attached to the viewport. A page has a full width cookie approval dialog. A notification is implementing as a sticky header. And in the keyboard, focus is moved to the notification so at least part of the focus indicator is in the view. Oh, so they remove that. Okay. And focus appearance. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. That's interesting. Um, that's very interesting because they get rid of. They say no, that's bullshit. They also get rid of other things like this. You know, they get rid of the concurring input mechanism. I know they say that motion action. Hmm. Okay. Holy moly. Input modalities. So what changed here is label name, motion action, target size enhancing, and then concurring input mechanism, dragging movement, and target size minimum. In fact, they removed that. They remove. No, they added. This is what the 2.2 exactly. This is the 2.2, and this is the 2.1, and navigable, distinguishable. All right. If this is operable, they have the same navigable. This is the 2.1. Oh, they enhance that. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, they enhance that. Exactly. They enhance that. Exactly. They enhance that. Do you have the dragging movement? Mm-hmm. Okay, makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. So they enhance that inputs modality. The same for inputs modality. Okay. Exactly. Dragging movement, target size enhance, and target size minimum and enhance. Oh, they okay. Dragging movement. Mm-hmm. And then you have not the understandable. All right. They add now the predictable, consist help, and then the input assistant. Okay. Yeah, that might go the scope of today's video. I do think this is part of the CSS. In any case, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Redundant entry, accessible authentication minimum and enhance. The parsing, now it becomes obsolete, and the name, role, and values. Mm-hmm. The name, role, and values here. Accessible API. A Java applet use the accessibility API defined by the language. Mm-hmm. Situation: if you're using a standard, if using a standard user interface component is a markup language, using area label to provide accessible name where visible label cannot be used, using variable labeled by provide name, using markup features to expose a name and role, using HTML form controls and link. Oh, this is a technique. Holy hell, it actually is telling you. Mm-hmm. Link, or link with a logo, or link with a logo and explain the alt. Example 2, buttons. Okay, or with value, or button example C with now as an input, save, and this button example D and title save the file. Text input example A or B. Input area label, type of fruit, ID text, and type text. Okay, whether you're using now the label to match this makes sense, or use an input area label. In example B, the input field has the same role as an example A, but the value is the empty string, and the field getting the same name from area label properly. From accessibility here. And checkbox. Okay, radio buttons. Like this. For R1, R2, and R3. Radio field set. And its following is this. Hey, this is the legend. This is the red. You match the ID with that. Select element. Okay, is this okay? That's interesting, because now it makes a lot of sense, because now I do have I know where to look at it. I know where to look when I need to work with forms. Most of the time I'm not going to do that, but it's important to know when you read the code. Using label elements associate text label with form controls, like this technique. Right? Exactly. Or even a checkbox. And for markup length that match the ID. And group of radio buttons. Right? Again, match the ID with that, so now the browsers can actually identify this. Oh, this is a field set. Oh, yeah, I do get it. Name, role, and value here. So here you can actually look at using the title attribute in the iframe element. Okay. Using the title here to describe the iframe content. Okay. Using the title attribute to identify form controls when label elements cannot be used. Using HTML according to spec. Using area label to provide a name using interface. Using where area, y area, y I WAI. I don't know how you pronounce it. That my God, area. State and property attribute to expose the state of the user component. Creating a component using technology to support the accessibility notifications. Okay, this is okay. Sufficient techniques. Using standard user interface component in a markup language. If using a script or code to repurpose standard user interface component in markup. If using a standard user interface component in programming technologies. Provide label for interactive form controls in PDF document. If creating your own user interface component in a programming language. Okay. Using WARE to state property attribute to expose that. Or the other is this. Okay. That's interesting. You can use now AI to help you fill this or to tell, okay, to checking all of these boxes. to tilt. Okay. Yeah, you can use AI to tilt all of these checkboxes. That's starting to make a lot of sense here. Holy moly! So they get into this. So that's why they have this. These UI patterns are documented by Waria. Exactly, and generally understood by the community. However, the implementations provided us by the web platforms are inadequate. They are either non-existent, lacking in functionality, or cannot be customized sufficiently. So developers are forced to build custom components, an incredibly difficult task. As a result, most components on the web are inaccessible, non-performant, and lacking important features. Our goal is to create a well-funded open source component library that the community can use to build accessible design systems. Accessible, unstyled, open, uncontrolled developer experience, and incremental adoption. But all of these components allegedly they are follow the WARIA area or the accessibility guidelines. Author in practice guide. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Accessible rich internet applications. It's an initiative. How to build accessibility semantics into web patterns and widgets. Okay. That's interesting. Holy moly. Okay. An alert and a dialogue, a message, breadcrumb, buttons, carousel, dialogue, combo box, check boxes. Thanks to the internet and all the people that contribute to this. Holy fuck, nigga. Combo box patterns. Okay, holy moly. Example, select only combo box. Read first. Or editable combo box less into inline here. Or you can do it something like this. Exactly. Delaware. Oh, okay. Editable combo box list with autocomplete. Editable combo box with grip pop-up. Date picker combo box. Disclosure, show and hide, feed, grid interactive tabular, data and layout container, landmarks. A set of 8 roles that identify the major security on major sections on a page. Main landmark, navigation, search, banner, content info. Oh my god, this is exactly what I was looking. It's like, oh, the community has evolved. Oh my god. The community. Oh fuck. Oh crap. Oh crap. I get it. Okay. Holy moly. I'm laughing because there is so a lot of people they already ask this question across the globe and say, hey, you know what? How in the F do have consistent designs to help us cover common problems, bro? At least from the UI. So the same as you have now designed patterns for programming, you have now designed patterns for UI elements. Design system or system. Okay, system designs. Oh, oh my god. Okay. list box, links, menu bar, menu, meter, slider multi-thumb, radio button, spin button, switch, table, tabs, toolbars, tooltips, tree view, tree grids, window splitter. Mm-hmm. 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 But again, this is just to over at Copen. Exactly. Can I? No, I can't modify it. I can mute. I can change this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly. Accessibility window splitter. Exactly. Oh, god damn. Accessibility window splitter, man. Mm-hmm. Okay. Alright. Holy moly. And they changed that? Oh, and okay. So if you go to the chapter 3, for example, it's going to go to that. That's right. Mm-hmm. You go to chapter 2, to this chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and they don't populate more data as it is. Holy shit. Okay, this is very, very, very interesting. Um, oh, okay, makes a lot of sense why Radix has become made by Work OS. Mm, 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 mm. Okay, so Work OS is a competition of Auth, all right, or Auth to do that, right? Enterprise Single Sign-On, which is another ISP, no IDP, Identity Provider, IDP, mm-hmm. And Work OS. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, exactly. It's because I think we could have done even more business if we have partnered with WorkOS early. It is being incredibly well received. Mm-hmm. Exactly, because now they help to that perfect perplexity. Copy.ai. Indeed. With another provider, you probably won't get the same level of support that WorkOS provide. Mm-hmm. WorkOS. Okay. Mm-hmm. I do get why this okay. User management, enterprise SEO, radar, role-based access control, directory sync, authkit, MCP auth, admin portal, vault. Mm-hmm. Okay. But again, start selling to enterprise customers with just few lines of code. Implement features like sign in, like single sign in minutes. So you have WorkOS, and the other is Clerk, right? Clerk.com. More than authentication, complete user management, right? Sound Open Router, Samaya, David. Pixel Perfect UIs embedded in minutes. Clerk. Everything you need for your authentication. Um, exactly, but they now provide is this trust by startup and work company. The best practice built into their sign in and user profile. Components will take months to implement in house, yet no sacrifice is made in terms of enterprise sensibility and they are now on the same boat here. Clear feels like the first time I boot my computer with an SSD. It is so much faster and simpler that I can change how I do things. Mm-hmm. But clerk, okay, okay, okay. So those clerk in WorkOS are IDP, identity providers. More like providers. They're like managers, something like that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Holy fuck. That's interesting. That was massive as well. Not a traditional identity provider. Cloud is an authentication and user management platform. Okay. WorkOS is an enterprise authentication integration platform. Its main focus is enterprise single sign-on and directory syncing user for corporate directory, and admin portal for self-service SSO setup. User management includes basic authentication similar to Clerk. Mm-hmm. Works primarily helps with integrate with existing identity providers rather than being one in itself. And Clerk act as the authentication system for your application rather than integrated with external IDP. Key difference: Clerk, your app use Clerk as an authentication system. In WorkOS, your app uses WorkOS to connect to your customer existing enterprise identity provider. If you want to manage your own authentication solution, okay, okay. So Clerk follows a bottom-up approach. When you are exactly a bottom-up approach, when you are a startup and don't have a user base, and don't have a user base and to have a and you have a small user base. So whereas WorkOS is a top down approach. When you are an established company, okay, when you're an established company that needs exactly, when you have an established company holding large user base, across different identity providers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Clerk is for setting up your own authentication systems. Okay. That's a great way to categorize the difference between these two platforms. Clerk, bottom-up approach, target startup, indie developers, and early stage company. Okay, I need an authentication built quickly so I can focus on my core products. Exactly, starting point. Whereas WorkOS is a top-down approach. Targets scale up, selling B2B, especially moving up market, Enterprise customers are asking for SSO and SIM before they'll buy. Already have customer now need to land bigger deals. Mm-hmm. Okay. Grow path start free, add users, eventually add enterprise features if needed. Win enterprise deal, IT manage configuration SSO, onboarding. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you're launching it out fast, users sign up and individually and use WorkOS when your sales team say we lost a deal because we don't support their IDP or customer needs sounds SSO. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting stuff, you know. That's a very interesting stuff. Okay. Mm-hmm. 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 The customer needs sound SSO. Okay. That's a very interesting thing to know about it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Holy, that was a lot. That was a lot to take in. Yeah, that was a lot to take in. That was a lot, and it makes a lot of sense because they are following is the this, right? Uh, Using of course React for to cover all of these cases. Tooltips, toolbar. They don't mention any of the tooltips. They don't mention tooltips. They don't have tooltips. You got a tooltip, right? And yeah, and okay. So this is actually so Radix is following the web accessibility content guidelines for okay authoring practice guide. Okay, okay. So this okay. So making this application accessible, making this internet application accessible by following is these guidelines. This is what Radix follow, and it is made by the WorkOS, which is a startup. It's even working with Snowflake. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay, temporal Snowflake. Indeed, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Cursor, Perplexity, Versal, and all of this. Replit. That's a very interesting thing that is happening. Okay, so that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.